Okay, like Rosie said, my name is Christina. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Human Genetics. And I'm gonna give you just a very kind of brief introduction and overview about kind of the broad area of my thesis research that brings together the fields of neuroscience and genetics. So I don't know about you, but I've always been a really curious person. I kind of always want to know why things work the way they do, why things are the way they are. And I think that's why I was drawn to science. So maybe you guys can relate to that as fellow science nerds here. But since about middle school, I was always particularly fascinated by the brain. It's our most complex organ. It's really this intricate machine that's responsible for a whole host of tasks, right? So for example, the brain coordinates our personality and emotions. It dictates whether or not we're a more anxious person or kind of more laid back and chill. It regulates our most basic functions, like talking to our muscles to coordinate movements or coordinating even sleeping and eating. It also is where our memories lie, right? It helps us distinguish our grandma from a robot so we can remember where our house is. And even helps us remember tasks like riding a bike, even if we haven't done that task in years. And of course, our brains are responsible for our cognitive abilities like thinking and learning and knowing languages. So it's this truly amazing organ that we have. And I've also been fascinated, though, about how delicate these processes are, right? How easily they can get perturbed. So in disorders of psychiatric disorders like bipolar and schizophrenia, they can result in these drastic changes to our feelings and perceptions and moods, right? Our sleep cycles can be severely affected in insomnia. Disorders like dementia or Alzheimer's can affect some of our memories, but not all of them. And disorders like autism and other cognitive disorders affect our higher levels of thinking and communicating. So clearly there's this really delicate balance between function and dysfunction in the brain, and scientists are actively trying to understand this. So this is kind of my area of expertise. So to do this, in order to study this, we first have to understand our study system, the brain. So what is the brain made of? How does it work? If we look carefully, kind of zoom in, we can see that the brain is comprised of neurons. That's the cells that make up the brain. These guys are the main workhorses of the brain. So these neurons are cells, and the brain is comprised of billions of these guys, and they're all connected to each other. They have these really beautiful processes that help them to connect and talk, and that's their job, is to talk to each other. So they relay messages and send signals about what they're experiencing and what's going on. This is how the brain works, right? It's just a bunch of yapping cells talking to each other all the time. But how do they know how to be neurons, right? Like, how do they know how to talk the neuron language and to understand each other and to relay these messages effectively? So again, let's kind of get to know our study system. If we zoom in on this beautiful neuron here, we can see that just like any other cell, inside it has DNA. So, okay, we've heard that DNA is this like code of life, right? And so it has this instruction manual to make our whole body. So now we're getting somewhere. This is probably the thing that's making a neuron and kind of has a role in how the neurons talk to each other. But how does it do that exactly? So DNA is our body's instruction manual, and it's in actually every single cell in our body. Our bodies are made up of cells, and if you took the DNA from just one cell and just stretched it out, it would be over 6 feet tall, taller than I am, just from one cell. So it's a lot of information, right? And so all the information is encoded in genes, and those genes make proteins. So these are kind of the words in our body instruction manual that is DNA, these genes and proteins. But again, this is a lot of information, and so it has to encode for our whole body, right? So all these messages can make different things for the brain or anything else in the body, like the ear and the leg and things like that. So this is what makes neurons neurons, right? They're talking, they're speaking the same language because they have the brain genes on so that they can understand each other and communicate, and the brain can function like it should. That makes sense. But wait a second, I just said that every cell has the same DNA, and all of our genes encode for everything in the body. So how can we kind of restrict the messages so that in the brain or in the neurons, we're only getting the brain messages and not anything else? So how are the neurons saying the right words at the right time? So this is a cartoon that I took from Beatrice, the biologist. If you guys don't know her, she has a lot of really clever stuff online, so I would check her out. So what we're seeing here is DNA kind of yapping away and talking. It's saying, oh, I got all these genes, I'm gonna make these proteins, it's gonna be so great. And we see this orange guy come up and be like, shh, no. So it's just silencing the DNA right there. So this is actually a cartoon of what's happening in our bodies. Our bodies have this mechanism to silence the DNA, silence these words, the DNA and proteins that are coming, the genes and proteins that are coming off of DNA. So this is what I study. If we're in the brain, we can have this silencing mechanism in place to make sure these non-brain genes are turned off and we only get the brain genes expressed, right? So this way we have our happy, chatty neurons, we have this full conversation, they're sending brain messages to each other. So now we can understand how our study system works. We can kind of get to know why and how things can start not working, where the dysfunction can happen in this process. So what happens if this silencing mechanism gets perturbed? And when you want to turn off the non-brain genes when you're in the brain, what happens when they stay on, when they're not supposed to? Well, in your neurons, then you got all these mixed signals, right? You get these really confused neurons. They're getting all of these messages that they have never heard before. They don't know what to do with this information, so the conversation can't be as lively, right? The neurons can't talk to each other as efficiently as they could before. They're getting mixed messages, so the conversation can't happen. The messages can't get through like they're supposed to, which means the brain's not functioning the way it should, right? So what happens, conversely, if you do have the silencing mechanism in place, that's fine, but it's actually working on the wrong genes. So you're turning off the wrong words, so that now when you're in the brain, your brain messages actually go away. So now you're left with cells that maybe aren't even brain cells. They're kind of these immature cells that never got the message to become brain cells. So again, your conversation is less between the neurons, right? Because some of them aren't even neurons, they're not able to talk to each other, the brain can't function the way that it should. So now we kind of learn the power of genetics and kind of this regulation of the gene expression or the words that are coming off of the DNA and how it can affect organs like the brain. And so this is really important in expressing the right genes in the right place at the right time, right? Let's think about during development, how important this might be when you're a young developing fetus or baby, you want to grow, but you don't necessarily want to keep growing into adulthood and beyond. You want to turn some genes off. You don't want those same baby genes on then when you're a baby as when you're an adult. And if your messages get disrupted kind of early on, that can affect you for the rest of your life, right? And that happens in some developmental disorders like autism or intellectual disability. Or if those messages don't get perturbed until later on, you could be totally fine throughout most of your life, but then have these problems come up later on in life, and that could be something like dementia or Alzheimer's. We also talked about how our brain is responsible for so many different functions, but what we didn't talk about was how the brain functions are actually kind of segregated into specialized areas of the brain. And so again, you don't want necessarily a memory part of the brain acting like a sleep part of the brain, right? You want them to have their separate, distinct functions. So again, if this kind of message system, the silencing mechanism gets disturbed, you could have some problems. Also, we're studying how things like the environment can affect our genes as well. Things like smoking or medications or illness can change how our genes are regulated or how these messages get sent. So studying this mechanism, these regulators of gene expression, can be so informative to learning how the brain develops and functions, or really any organ. So now we can kind of start to understand the bigger picture and how all these functions that the brain does is carried out by the neurons, and how the neurons work by communicating with each other, and how they know to speak the same common brain language that's encoded in our DNA. And we can also appreciate how any small change along the way can really disrupt brain function in a very specific way. And this is what I'm studying. I'm studying how some of these silencing mechanisms can get perturbed in cognitive disorders such as autism and intellectual disability. So this is what I do. This is what I study. It's me, obviously, at the microscope. I'm a scientist. I do research and perform experiments in the lab. We use mice that have this silencing mechanism that's disrupted. And so these mice mimic cognitive disorders like autism and intellectual disability, and I can study them. So I can look at their brains and try to figure out exactly what's going on and where the problem is, and I can ask a whole host of questions and perform experiments. So I can see how the neurons are built, how they look normally, these beautiful branching neurons that can talk to each other really well, or in the case when you have these silencing mechanisms disturbed, how this can alter the brain function, the neuron, how it looks, and how it can't communicate as well. We can also study the words that are coming off of the DNA. We can study the gene expression, and we can look at the chattiness kind of the neurons and how many genes are upregulated or where they're on when they shouldn't be on, or downregulated when they're off when they really shouldn't be off. And we can write all of this up, all of our research findings, and publish them in papers and share them with our scientific colleagues and peers and interested people like you guys, so you can learn about what we learned about. We share our knowledge, and you can ask other questions and build on our experiments and ask bigger and better things so we can keep on learning more. So I hope I've shown you today a little glimpse into the power of genetics and how it's a way that scientists are learning more about how our brains work. And before I finish, I just wanted to end with a very selfish plug for any interested teachers out there. I started this group called Michigan DNA Day that sends volunteer scientists into mainly high school classrooms across the state of Michigan to present fun, interactive activities about genetics. This is a free program. It just takes a day of your time, and we send the scientists into your classroom. If you're interested, please let me know. I'll be here for the rest of the day through lunch and presenting some activities at the end. I'm so happy to talk about it. So with that, I'll end. I will take any questions, and also just wanted to say thank you to all of you as educators and being champions for science. We appreciate so much what you do every single day. Thank you.